Hello friends, welcome to UGC EPG Pathshala. I am Atika Tajdar from Department of Geography, Jamia Millia Islamia. Today we'll discuss about supply chain resilience in disaster management. Supply chain is mainly considered as a set of entities that are collected together in order to encompass their necessary resources to address the final consumer needs. According to Douglas H. Norrie, the supply chain encompasses all activities associated with the flow and transformation of the goods from the raw material stage through to the end user, as well as the associated information flows. Materials and information flow both upstream and downstream the supply chain. This definition expands the boundary of the supply chain activities not only to flow of goods but also the information. The need of efficient flow of goods is addressed by a crucial segment of the supply chain logistics, which can be defined as the efficient and cost-effective process of planning, implementation, controlling, and integration of the inventory, warehousing, and distribution systems, as well as the related information to maximize the customer satisfaction and reduce the overall cost as the main part of supply chain process. Logistic and supply chain management in disaster response. Supply chain management, especially in the field of disaster response, encompasses the planning and management of all activities involved in sourcing and procurement, conversion, and all logistic management activities with parallel coordination and collaboration along channel partner, which can be suppliers, intermediaries, third-party service, and providers and customers. Integration and consolidation of resources is more important to have more efficient and effective performance. Supply Chain Management Center of Nimrod University has formulated the most embracing definition, which is demand and supply chain management is the management of a network that link customer and supplier as one single entity with the objective to create value and reduce waste through the voluntary integration and coordination of the objectives of three or more and ideally all the independent parties in the network. Logistic management defined by the Council of Supply Chain Management Professional is as a part of supply chain management that plans, implements, and control efficient, effective forward and reverse flow and storage of goods, services, and related information between the point of origin and the point of consumption in order to meet customers' requirements. This includes inbound and outbound transportation management, fleet management, warehousing, materials handling, order fulfillment, logistic network design, inventory management, supply and demand planning, and management of third-party logistic services providers. Supply chain vulnerability. The term supply chain vulnerability has equal importance to variability, velocity, and volume in the element of the supply chain and evaluate the supply chain based on the acceptance level of disaster logistics steps, which are planning, detection, mitigation, response, and recovery. A different school divides the supply chain sources of risk into internal and external factors. Internal risk arises from the activity running within the supply chain. On the other hand, external risks are usually the outcome of interaction between the supply chain and its environment. For instance, terrorist attack, natural disaster, etc. This resource of risk can influence the supply chain and make it more vulnerable. The worst situation can happen when both internal and external sources causes the disruption simultaneously. The supply chain resilience has been always one of the main concern of managers, since the ability of an enterprise to confront unexpected event is the matter of its own success or failure. The term resilience essentially pertains to the ability of a system to return to its original state or move to new, more desirable state after being disturbed or degraded due to a variation of reasons. Various pillars on which a resilient supply chain rests can be depicted as humanitarian logistic and relief chain, which is humanitarian logistic is supposed to assist those people who are influenced by the disaster. These may be provided to those who are in much need of this help. This must be given based on the proportion of their needs. A series of activities or steps are needed for monitoring of the process right from the storage to the distribution. Different methods like ID cards or head counts, etc. may be used to apply this method. Humanitarian logistics as the process of planning, implementing and controlling the efficient cost-effective flow and storage of goods and materials as well as related information from the point of origin to the point of consumption for the purpose of meeting the end of beneficiaries' requirement and alleviating the suffering of vulnerable people. Proper response to the humanitarian need in case of disasters is considered to be mitigation and satisfying the initial and vital need of the survivors. Resilience in humanitarian aid logistic. During the relief operation in disaster, the performance of the humanitarian aid supply chain is affected due to the lack of coordination approaches and less joint and holistic supply chain strategies between operation management and human actors. The huge number of involved governmental agencies, non-governmental organizations, UN faculties, international institutes, manufacturers and third-party logistics providers, which are various in the nature, size, abilities, specialties and performance, demand for coordination, cooperation and well management of the humanitarian role in case of natural disaster. A collective strategy may be able to improve the performance of humanitarian supply chain during disasters. Supply chain vulnerability and resilience. It is important to find those factors that make a system more vulnerable to disruption. Removing those factors or limiting them will increase the supply chain resilience, which means the ability of those chains to recover to their initial or even better state in case a disruption will happen. Creating supply chain resilience. Essentially, there are four main principles which must be followed while making a resilient supply chain. First one is built-in features make the supply chain more capable of recovering itself to the previous stage in case any unpleasant event happens. Second, there is a necessity of collaborative effort in order to identify the risk sources. By finding the risk sources, removing those sources or preparedness for their consequence will be possible. Third is agility is vital for the supply chain resiliency. The more a supply chain is capable of quickly reacting to unexpected event, the more resilient it becomes. And the fourth one is it is important to widen our perspective and not to limit the possible sources of the risk just within the supply chain. It's crucial to consider other supply chain or network to be of high potential to impose the risk into our network. Mapping the supply chain. To realize weaknesses of the supply chain, it is crucial to picture it flawlessly. By detecting the bottleneck and limitation, there are some characteristics that are make a strain for the supply chain, which is long lead times, monopoly in supply, lack of visibility, and association of a link or node to high level or risk, etc. Single sourcing approach in supply can reduce the cost and facilitate the quality control procedure. However, single sourcing increases the vulnerability of supply chain. All the entities that are moving toward resiliency must take this act into consideration that a balance between cost orientation and resiliency tendency must exist. Supply chain strategy must not limit the entity within the chain. Pure cost-oriented supply chains may look successful from the financial perspective, but in case of any interruption, the consequences of the unexpected event can be severe and may impose vast amount of cost to them. Creating risk management culture. Risk management culture must be created in the wider perspective and through the whole network. Supply chain risk assessment must be also done to realize the vulnerable nodes and links. Finally, a risk management that must exist within the business to frequently update the supply chain risk information. The presented factors must be prioritized or crucial in designing improving the supply chains, because in case of natural or man-made disaster, a vulnerable supply chain can intensify the consequences of the disaster and increase the risk of losing more human lives. These trends are quickly growing world population and the larger concentration of assets in high-risk areas combine to create an environment in which natural disasters are increasing in frequency and intensity. The main challenges after disaster happening is how to get the right amount of resources to the place of disaster to cover the initial need of survivors in less amount of time, which is the task of relief supply chain management team. Coordination and decision issues. The role and responsibility of the government at the national, state, provincial, local or tribal levels must be recognized in the event of a major international disaster. Even when permission is granted, there are still some occasional conflict of authority and delays in decision making due to distance, communication impediments or misunderstanding. Supply chain structure. In each particular disaster, some special organizations are involved based on severity, location, the nature of the disaster, availability of potential participants, anticipated need, and prescribed procedures. Thus, the relief group membership could change from one disaster to another, adding an extra dimension of complication to the coordination. Self-initiated response. After any disaster occurrence, supply chain management team receive requests from number of uninvited, unexpected and unexperienced individuals, groups or even NGOs who come up to the stage following a disaster. While they can be of immense help at the time of dire need, they may also create numerous problems, which are they compete for coordination, communication, logistic and sustenance capacity like everyone else. They often need more coordination efforts since they did not participate in any prior planning efforts. They often disrupt the efforts of others. Now, secondary relief chain activities. Focusing on reconstruction and restoration of the infrastructure towards normalcy is the main request of the disaster survivors after the urgency of the initial disaster response and the creation of condition in which the affected population is safe. The implication of this is that the restoration phase need to explicitly consider during pre-planning and execution of the response to the disaster. Explicitly taking into the account their restoration phase during early planning could avoid some of the problems that arise after disaster. Apart from managerial difficulty, creating an effective and efficient humanitarian aid logistic is sentenced to the challenging and prone to suffering from different barriers which are explained below. Humanitarian logistic and relief supply chain steps. Considering the number of organizations, workers and relief items arriving on the ground zero, there are very few important steps which are essentially required during the disaster response under the humanitarian logistic and supply chain umbrella. Resource mobilization or financial and human resources. Once the response operation is underway after any disaster, various organizations allocate available resources and begin requesting additional resources via the appeals process. Human resource must be mobilized in the form of a professional humanitarian worker, volunteers, firemen, ambulance worker, police or military staff. Resources may also undergo different level of training, skills and affiliation. Training may vary across and within the organization. Relief supply chain umbrella. Coordination, collaboration and communication, known as relief supply chain umbrella, are vital among organizations taking part in response operation because of the various goals and objectives that may include management of transportation, supply chain techniques for humanitarian logistics, education and training, resource management, partnership with military, logistic information system which is also called LIS, assessment of damage. Despite seemingly conflicting mandates, it is vital that those involved in the humanitarian operation find a way to collaborate in order to provide relief in complementary and efficient way. Without this, efforts are certain to be duplicated in some areas while entirely omitted in others. This would increase the sense of abandonment in certain sections of the affected population and hamper the overall relief operation. Method of data collection. There are different ways for collecting data and information. The most appropriate and common way for data gathering is research methods are surveys and literature reviews, talking with people and personal interviews, surveys via email and phone, email and internet surveys. Although it is a bit hard to get update information by this way, but it is one of the cheapest way of information gathering. Web search and internet based information are the fastest way for collecting data. In this study, a literature review for better understanding of humanitarian logistic and supply chain definitions and term supply chain vulnerability and resilience and an empirical data gathering through a case study review has been done to address the research question of the thesis with focus on prevailing practices. Strategies of information gathering. Primary or secondary information are two different types of data and information which can be gathered. Primary type of information is gathered by the researcher or investigator himself, usually through face-to-face or personal interviews, library research and surveys, internet and web-based or surveys or questionnaires. The secondary sources is one which has already been collected, existed and documented by other scientists and researchers and are available in different sources. By attention to the main parameters of the primary information gathering strategy and regarding to our time banding and economical limitation, investigation directly at the place of disaster and also face-to-face interview with the member of the relief logistic and supply chain for better data collecting and information gathering were impossible. To be able to assemble a strong theoretical and experimental basis for further research and application, a collection of secondary information and data is made from literature review of internet and web-based humanitarian logistic and supply chain books, journals and such open sources is utilized. Qualitative and quantitative methods. In general, qualitative research creates pure, exhaustive and applicable data and information that contribute in-depth understanding of the context. Qualitative research is based on gathering, analyzing and understanding data and information through observing what others do and say. Quantitative research creates reliable population-based and generalizable data and information which are well suited to establishing cause and effects affair. Quantitative research method is a kind of research involving the use of organized questions where the response options are predictable and a large number of respondents are involved. A quantitative and qualitative method of literature review is parallel with deductive research approach on both published articles and reviewed cases studied conducted to government and media document, and surveys are the basis to make the theoretical framework in this research. Focus on the existing view and perspective to develop the research through the relationship between human and variable and abilities associated with organizational and operational variable within the supply chain resilience sound crucial. To improve the conceptual model, we strongly believe that detail and points regarding humanitarian aids in the relief chain resilience will obtain through some off-site and on-site interviews which should be attained to the research purposes. Case study method. Case study research method is an empirical qualitative method of research which usually been used to extend the complexities and issues of the previous experiences and researches, with exact and detailed examining and investigating of the few number on rules, conditions, events, accidents, assumption and their relation by the researcher and scientist. Case study research method highlight the result of various contextual analysis of the above factor in real life situations. This can be defined as an empirical inquiry that investigates a contemporary phenomena within its real life context, when the boundaries between phenomena and the context are not clearly evident and in which multiple sources of evidence are used. Although some scientists and researchers believe that validity and reliability of the research is in place of doubt by the way, majority trust it and continue to use the case study research method with success in carefully planned and crafted studies of real-life situation, issues and problems. Through the establishing of planned and targeted how, why and what forming questions, the framework and focusing point of the case study and research complexity and also object and purpose of it will be clear during the study. These questions are usually about the condition, situation, difficulties, faced problems and the weaknesses of the entire achievement in previous studies. Because of the intricately political, social, historical, geographical and economic effect of the research and study situation, and because of the limited number of events, condition and relation on the way of an entire case study research, the researcher investigate and follow up the object and purpose of the researches by the variety method of the information review and data gathering by the availability of the sources. Reliability. Reliability is the extent to which a study operations can be repeated with the same results. Reliability also involves the accuracy of the chosen research. In fact, the reliability of the study is acceptable if another researcher can conduct the same research and carry out the same result. Researchers should provide the same result at different times if the conditions are identical. Reliability through the case study research method refers to the stability, accuracy, and precision of the measurement. Exemplary case study design ensure that the procedures used are well documented and can be repeated with the same result over and over again. This research was performed in both theoretical and practical perspective, and we tried to use more scientific literature, also more case studies. Therefore, an acceptable level of reliability could be verified. Evidently, statistically and quantitative method of research are not quite suitable for this kind of case study research, as reviewing the literature and documented cases related to humanitarian, logistic and relief supply chain. This research also invites other students of logistic and supply chain to make further work and investigation on different perspectives of humanitarian logistic, humanitarian supply chain, relief supply chain and their improvements. Thank you.